Hello everybody, welcome to A British Audiophile. For those of you who are new to this channel and haven't seen me before, my name is Taran. What's the deal with these R2R ladder DACs? They seem to be getting an awful lot of love lately, including from reviewers such as myself. It's not like it's new technology. Using resistor ladders to do the digital to analog conversion has been around since digital audio was invented in the 1980s. Most modern DACs use a digital to analog conversion process known as delta sigma. It gives much better measured performance than an R2R ladder DAC, and that includes some of the FPGA DACs, for example the likes of Chord. The FPGA is just a programmable chip which is much larger and allows Rob Watts, the designer, to have a more sophisticated digital filter. So what's the deal? Well, the reality is that they sound absolutely awesome, and let me let you into a little bit of a secret. There's an element of audiophiles out there with high-end systems that have always coveted R2R ladder DACs for their natural sonic presentation. The difference really is now that the cost has come down, primarily because of advancements in technology and the precision of resistors in particular. But also there's a couple of new players on the block that have emerged in the last few years from China. These DACs are designed and built to exacting standards, and if they'd come from the established audiophile companies, I think they'd have cost an awful lot more. Today we're going to have a look at another brand that's getting an awful lot of positive attention at the moment. Holo Audio and their new Spring 3 DAC. This is an R2R ladder DAC that measures as well as delta sigma DACs. Actually, we're in for a bit of a treat. I was really pleased when Magna Hi-Fi, that's the European distributor for Holo Audio, agreed to send me the Spring 3, and that's because I have the Denafrips Pontus II here at the same time, and it's a direct competitor. I've also been comparing those two DACs to one of the new DACs from SMSL. The VMV D1 SE that retails for around £650 in the UK. It has excellent measured performance. Try and find something for around the same money that sounds as good with a volume control and a remote. I think you'll struggle. On paper, the D1 SE should be all the DAC that you need. So let's see how the Holo Spring 3 compared to those two DACs. The Holo Audio Spring 3 DAC is distributed in Europe by Magna Hi-Fi. It comes in 3 levels of spec. Level 1 retails for €2,359, but doesn't come with the CNC remote control. The €2,649 Level 2 DAC does, and comes with upgraded Holo Audio branded filter caps for the power supply. The KTE model retails for €3,370 and has a number of tweaks. The most significant being an uprated flat wire-wound O-ring transformer and the internal copper wiring replaced for Ono continuous cast, that's OCC, silver wire. All models have the option of a fully discrete and fully balanced analog preamp module fitted for €550. It's the level 2 DAC with the preamp module that I'm reviewing today. The Spring 3 is what I would consider a full width unit at 43 centimeters 17 inches. It weighs an impressive 8.5 kgs, 18.7 pounds, largely down to its heavy gauge chassis and front plate, which you can only fully appreciate when you see the unit in person. There's a button to take the unit out of standby, a crystal clear OLED display, a mute button, menu and toggle buttons to move between sources, and switch the display off. If the preamp module is fitted, you can adjust the volume here. Full functionality can also be accessed from the CNC machine remote control, which is also substantially built. There are single-ended RCA as well as balanced XLR analog output connections, a professional AES EBU digital input, coaxial, BNC, optical, USB, and yes, an I2S that I would look for at a unit at this price. There's some very clever stuff going on inside the Spring 3 DAC. Designer Jeff Zhu has based the Spring 3 much more closely on the May DAC, which is more expensive than the previous Spring 2. Both the May and the Spring 3 share the same R2R ladder technology. The main difference is that the May is a fully dual design with a separate R2R ladder board for the left channel and a separate R2R ladder board for the right channel. Also, the power supply on the May is in a separate chassis and dual mono. I don't want to go over old ground here, just in the interest of keeping things concise, and there's plenty of new things to discuss. so I'm going to reference a couple of my older videos. If you're interested in finding out how an R2R ladder DAC works, or you just want to remind yourself, check out my review of the Denafrips Ares II. If you're interested in finding out how to clean up digital signals, well, you might want to check out my review of the Denafrips Iris. The Holo Audio Spring 3 uses something called a PLL, a phase lock loop, to lower jitter. Just briefly explain what jitter is. Digital information is sent in packets. Errors in the timing of those packets is known as jitter. And if your DAC has to work pretty hard to correct those errors in timing, the overall level of electrical noise in the DAC goes up, and that has an impact on sound quality. So what the heck is a PLL, or a phase lock loop? It's a negative feedback system that can be simplified and broken down into 3 blocks. The first block is a phase detector that detects the difference in phase between the input and the output signal. The difference in phase is then fed to a low pass filter because there's some high frequency content that has to be got rid of before it passes onto the voltage controlled crystal oscillator. That's what's responsible for the timing of information inside your DAC. As the name suggests, the VCO's output frequency can fluctuate with any change in voltage, but what the PLL does is ensure that the output signal's phase is identical to the input. You can probably appreciate now why having such a stable voltage on the crystal oscillator is so critical in determining that you have a stable output frequency and the impact that that potentially can have on the timing of information. The reality is, even with a PLL, you can still have variations in phase and voltage on the input. But if a PLL is implemented correctly within the clocking mechanism of a device, you should have vanishingly low levels of incoming jitter. It'd be remiss of me not to explain Jeff Zhu's patented technology, linear compensation. That's the reason why the Spring 3 has such good measured performance for an R2R ladder DAC, with a reported signal to noise ratio of 112 dB and a dynamic range of 128 dB, rivaling some of the best Delta Sigma DACs. In an R2R ladder DAC, the resistors have to switch on and off very quickly in order to assign a value to the incoming signal. For example, in a 16-bit ladder, the highest value that can be assigned is 2 to the power of 16, which is 32,768. But because of those resistors switching on and off so quickly, that might not necessarily be the value that's assigned. That's called quantization noise. In the Spring 3, there's an additional R2R ladder in each DAC that detects this error and fills in the gap. And that's why the Spring 3 has such good measured performance, with an accuracy of those resistors of 0.00005%. There's another thing I want to talk about before we take a tour of the inside. This is truly a non-oversampling DAC. There's no option for oversampling within the hardware of the device. If you want to do oversampling, you have to do it in the software and feed it to the DAC. It's available on the DAC, but not on the Spring 3, in order to keep things at this price. Oversampling is inherent in Delta Sigma designs. The incoming signal is sampled to a higher frequency so they can do something called noise shaping, pushing the noise to the ultrasonic frequency range where it can be filtered out. That's why Delta Sigma DACs typically have higher signal to noise ratios. The problem is there's quite a lot of heavy processing involved, which results in some artifacts, and that's why some people believe that Delta Sigma designs always sound a little bit artificial. Let's just take a moment to observe how well laid out this DAC is. Over here on the right hand side we have the AC inlet section, completely isolated from the rest of the DAC. That's an O-ring transformer. That's even less noisy than a toroidal transformer. And believe it or not, that's actually what gets upgraded in the KTE model to one with flat wire, I suppose the one with round wire here, to even lower noise further. And it's this wiring, I suppose, that gets replaced from copper to OCC silver in the KTE model as well. Over here we have the main power supply section with lots of filter capacitance. And next to that we have the digital input section. That Altera FPGA that you can see here deals with the operation of the DAC, the phase lock loop, but not DSD, and I'll come to that later. We have 2 crystal oscillators, one to deal with multiples of 44K, another one to deal with multiples of 48K that form part of the clock. And you can see the USB input here and the USB board with the XMOS processor that handles USB. These 2 little devices here are quite interesting. I can zoom in a bit. Hopefully you can see that break in the board. They're actually optical isolators So the USB input is completely isolated. There's no electrical connection between this side of the board and that side of the board. I believe the other digital inputs are isolated as well. Over here we have the optional preamp module. That's a fully discrete, fully balanced preamp, and it's trickled down technology from the Serene preamp that retails for the best part of €3,000. Obviously it's not exactly the same, but it shares an awful lot of technology with the Serene preamp. Might be a bit of a bargain at €550. It uses a stepped relay volume control as opposed to a potentiometer volume pot, because step relay controls have better linearity across the volume range. That is the analog output stage, which is also fully discrete and class A. These two capacitors here are actually part of the power supply, and that's actually what gets upgraded in the level 2 compared to the level 1. They're not in the signal path, they're not decoupling capacitors. You can't see the actual R2R ladder DAC because it's below that preamp board, so I'll post a picture up here just to show its operation. There's a fully discrete, fully balanced 24-bit resistor ladder to deal with the incoming PCM signal. There's something else, something that I believe is unique to Holo Audio, a separate resistor ladder to handle the incoming DSD signal. It's not R2R ladder architecture because that wouldn't be appropriate for DSD, but normally you would expect DSD to be handled within the FPGA of the DAC. Back out here again, I'm sure you can appreciate this is an exceptionally well engineered, exquisitely built DAC. Enough tech talk. How does the Holo Audio Spring 3 DAC sound? Quite frankly, excellent. It's class leading in terms of clarity and refinement whilst maintaining natural tonality. It's way beyond the fundamentals of what I look for in terms of sound quality, but I'll go through them for the sake of comprehensiveness. Bass has great definition and texture. I always get criticised by the pro audio industry camp for describing it as fast, and it's certainly true. Bass frequencies do take a little longer in your room to propagate, but it's also a characteristic that distinguishes many hi-fi components. A lot of them have a slightly bloated, ponderous nature, not a hint of it here. I threw everything at the Spring 3 just to see if I could trip it up in the mid-range. Male vocals with real authority, female vocals with a sweetness and lightness of touch, acoustic instruments that were difficult to reproduce. It passed all those tests with flying colours. The leading edges of notes were nicely defined. I'm talking about those transients. They were solid but not laser etched, and the decays were beautiful. No hint of anything being veiled or curtailed. These traits are there to some extent in the much more accessible SMSL VMV D1 SE. It's a very natural sounding DAC with excellent levels of clarity. The high frequencies often sort out the men from the boys, and that's the case here. There's nothing wrong with the D1 SE DAC, but in comparison to the Spring 3, it just sounds hard and grainy. The Holo Audio DAC simply has better refinement, and it has more of that airy quality on top that you crave from a high-end DAC. It's a similar story with the dynamics. D1 SE has very good dynamics, but in comparison to the Spring 3, they sound a little bit forced compared to the easeful dynamics on the Holo Audio DAC. If you just permit me here a quick anecdote that I use as a way of analogy. When I was working in my early days in the motor trade, I spent a stint working for BMW where I had to commute from London to Maidenhead on the motorway. It was about 35 miles. The first company car I was given was a BMW 320i. I was very happy with that car. 6 months later, I was given a 530i, a bigger car with a bigger engine. It sat on the motorway at the same speed, but it did it with a lot more ease and comfort. And that's the same here with these two DACs. Perhaps the most immediately obvious difference between the two DACs is in the sense of scale. You get a much wider and deeper soundstage with the Spring 3 compared to the D1 SE, and a lot more information about the acoustics of the recording, a greater sense of the space in which the recording actually took place. So what about the Denafrips Pontus II that I recently reviewed and awarded an outstanding? That's a much fairer comparison with the Holo Audio Spring 3. What surprised me most about these two DACs is how similar they sounded. You could actually cut and paste my remarks for the Spring 3 and put them in the Denafrips Pontus II review, but that isn't to say they sounded the same. I couldn't tell them much apart at high frequencies. In the mid-range, the Spring 3 was a little cleaner. It was easier to follow individual instruments. However, the Denafrips was tonally a little bit richer. It had a warmer, more full-bodied presentation. The soundstage width on the Spring 3 was a little bit wider, the soundstage depth on the Denafrips was a little bit deeper. In terms of the low frequencies, the bass definition and control was a little bit better on the Spring 3, but the Denafrips had a little bit more weight and authority to it. I wouldn't say one of these DACs sounds better than the other, just subtle differences in presentation. Deciding on whether you want to go for the Holo Audio Spring 3 or the Denafrips Pontus II is going to depend to some extent what you want from your system. If you want a touch more harmonic richness, go for the Denafrips. But if you're quite happy with how much tonal richness you already have in your system and you want more clarity and control, the Spring 3 is the one to go for. Something like the Hagel H190 is the minimum quality of amplifier I would use with the Holo Audio Spring 3 in order to appreciate its qualities. A suitable alternative would be the Yamaha AS1200 that has the power, the grip, the clarity and refinement to be a worthy proposition. As for speakers, they need to be around the level of my ProAct Response 1 SCs, but they're not available anymore and I can't tell you for sure if the current version, the DB1, sounds the same. The excellent ATC SCM19s are equivalent to my ProActs in terms of fidelity, perhaps even a little bit better in some regards, but they require amplifiers with a lot of power, so make sure you've got one of those on tap. I've only just finished reviewing the Ophidian Mambo 2s. They don't have the same sense of scale as my ProActs and the ATCs, but they're exquisitely detailed and very natural sounding, worth checking out if you live somewhere where you can get hold of them. I spent most of my time listening to the Holo Audio Spring 3 with my Exposure 21 Pre and 18 Super Mono blocks. Quite frankly, I didn't really want to switch to any other amplifier after listening to that. And it just goes to show as you improve your amplification, this DAC will reward you even more. If you've got an all-digital system and you're thinking whether you should go for the optional preamp module, it's a no-brainer in my opinion, unless you've got an excellent preamp already. I connected the Spring 3 directly to my Exposure mono blocks and it sounded a little bit cleaner than my Exposure 21 Pre. My Exposure 21 Pre is a very good preamp. It wasn't all one-way traffic though. With the preamp in place, the sense of scale, dynamics and the harmonic richness was greater. There's no way that you're going to be able to get a preamp of this quality for whatever this price is, 550 euros. The Holo Audio Spring 3 is the most detailed and refined DAC that I've reviewed to date. It has a beautiful, natural and neutral tonality. It's exquisitely constructed on the inside, built like a tank on the outside, with excellent functionality. The optional preamp module just adds even greater value. Sometimes these hyped up products can be a real letdown. That isn't the case today. I'm convinced, totally convinced, that the Holo Audio Spring 3 is one of the finest DACs that you can purchase for the money. Don't we live in a very fortunate era of hi-fi where we can get these products at a price that perhaps wouldn't have been conceivable even just a few years ago. The Holo Audio Spring 3 gets an outstanding from this channel. Well, that's it for me. Time for my usual outro, although I'm going to do it a little bit differently this time. If you like what I'm doing with this channel and you'd like to see it grow, please do that social media stuff. Hit the like, share, subscribe, hit that bell notification. And do check me out on Patreon if it's to offer support, join the ABA club, or check out some of the consultancy services that I offer. But for today, for now, I'm British Audiophile, signing off.